The next item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number S4M06035 in the name of Alison-McInnes on the Still Waiting campaign. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons now. I call on Alison-McInnes to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to have been able to secure a debate on Age Scotland's campaign Still Waiting, and I thank other members for their support of my motion. Age Scotland believes that the current bus pass scheme should be extended to include community transport routes, with the fares charged by community operators fully reimbursed, and I'm backing their campaign for a better bus pass scheme. This is not the first debate we've had in the Chamber about extending the National Concessionary Travel Scheme to community transport schemes, but we are still waiting for the Government to listen, understand the problem and take action. And the issue is fundamentally one of fairness. The National Concessionary Travel Scheme, introduced by the Liberal Democrat executive, has been largely a success. The objectives of that scheme were twofold. Firstly, to allow older and disabled people, especially those on low incomes, improved access to services, facilities and social networks by free scheduled bus services, and so to promote social inclusion. And secondly, to improve health by promoting a more active lifestyle for the elderly and disabled. But by and large, the majority of our elderly and disabled citizens have indeed reaped the benefits of this. They can get out and about and travel without worrying about the cost. And for those on fixed incomes like pensions, that's a real advantage. But here's the rub. For a significant minority, their bus pass is invalid on the services they rely on. They can't travel for free. They have to keep counting the pennies, limiting their opportunities to remain involved in their community, struggling to get out to the shops, their GPs or social clubs. Too many elderly and disabled people are at a financial disadvantage. They have a bus pass that's worthless. In remote and rural areas, people can't use their bus pass because they don't have any scheduled buses to travel on. And all across Scotland, people with mobility problems find they have a bus pass that is valid only on buses that don't meet their accessibility needs. Now, setting up such an ambitious scheme from scratch couldn't have been easy, and I don't criticise the previous executive for the anomalies that have since become apparent. They did, after all, have the foresight to say that the scheme would need to be reviewed after 3 years to see what needed to be amended. Now, sadly, that review was carried out by the SNP a few years ago, but it didn't take the opportunity to make the national scheme more inclusive and address this problem. But we can make it fairer, and I do urge the Scottish Government to commit to doing so. It's worth considering some facts from Age Scotland's research. While 87% of people aged over 60 in Scotland have an NCT card, in large urban areas that rises to 91% of older people, compared to just over 3/4 in rural areas. Whilst the majority of older people have an NCT card, a significant proportion of them do not use it, particularly those living in rural Scotland. Almost half, 47%, of those living in remote rural areas and 43% in accessible rural areas do not use their card, compared to more like a third of those across the whole of Scotland, or a fifth in large urban areas. In remote rural areas, over two-thirds, 70%, of those aged 60 or over either do not have a card or do not use it. That's a lot of people being shortchanged by the current system. It's clear the full benefits of concessionary fares are not felt in rural areas and areas less well served by traditional bus services. And it's a problem that's likely to grow as commercial bus operators continue to withdraw from routes on the grounds of cost. It will become more of an issue in our cities too. Those elderly and disabled who rely on the lifeline that is community transport have to pay their own fares. Who can say that's fair? Meanwhile, there are many people still in work who benefit from the free bus travel, and I'm sure we can all recall the previous Transport Minister liked to wave his pass around in the Chamber. Is that fair? Age Scotland have costed their proposals and identified how to fund it, and they're asking us here in Parliament to take a mature and consensual approach to tackling this. There are around 3.5 million community transport journeys each year. The average price of a single community transport journey is approximately £3.20. Reimbursing that at a full 100% reimbursement rate would cost around £11.2 million. It is entirely sensible and fair to suggest that this additional cost should be funded by adjusting the eligibility criteria for the existing scheme, in line with changes to the state pension age. I emphasise they're not suggesting that we change the criteria retrospectively, so it wouldn't affect anyone who has a bus pass at the moment. When money is tight, we must make it work hard for us. We must be sure it is spent wisely. There is a chance to refine the scheme to make it fairer. Who could really object to such a change? I think it's a virtuous proposal, equal dibs for all of our elderly and disabled citizens wherever they live. And that would mean our elderly and disabled would be able to afford to use community transport services more often, and so lead to a more secure future for our community transport providers, who will in turn be able to provide more services. The result? More active, less isolated people and reduced demand on health service. Research has identified that loneliness and social isolation carries a higher risk than lifelong smoking. Isolation is linked to depression and a lack of social interaction, with the onset of degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. And we know that nearly a fifth of older people don't speak to friends or family on a daily basis. We also know that by keeping older and disabled people independent, active and connected in their own communities, community transport makes people's lives better and improves their health. And that's well in keeping with the aims of the National Concessionary Travel Scheme as it stands. Community transport meets social needs like no other transport service can, and it's a cost-effective way of supporting some of society's most vulnerable people that we must maintain. Extending the bus pass to it will help make community transport more sustainable, but more importantly, it's the fairer thing to do. Age Scotland's case study booklet illustrates this very well. Let's hear from some of the people in it. Margaret from Dumfries says, "I have a bus pass, but it's virtually of no use to me. I've spent most of 2012 sitting at home waiting to die." Another Margaret from Carradale said, "A lot of the discussion these days is about keeping older people interested in things. We are interested in things, we just can't get to them." Or Helen from West Lothian. She said, "I don't want to be a prisoner in my own home as I get older, but the current bus system doesn't allow me to do many of the things I want to do." Tina from Kingussie said, "Just being on the bus was a social occasion. I miss that side of things. There should be link-ups. I can't be the only person around here who can't drive." Surely we owe it to the Margarets, Helen and Tina and all the others out there to try and make this fairer.
Thank you very much. We are a bit tight for time. Speeches of a tight 4 minutes, please. Jimmy D to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate Alison-McInnes for securing this debate this afternoon. It highlights the important contribution of the National Concessionary Travel Scheme, as well as that made by community transport services in urban and rural communities across the country. I am proud that the Scottish Government has safeguarded and funded both the scheme and community transport services during its time in office. It is clear that this investment makes a real difference to the lives of thousands of older or disabled people in Scotland, allowing them to live active, healthy and independent lives. Community transport services are, as we have heard, a vital lifeline service for many people. Whether it is attending a medical appointment, going shopping or travelling to a lunch club or other social activity, they make an invaluable contribution to the lives of many people. Empowering people to participate in the life of their community, tackling social isolation and loneliness, as Alison-McInnes said, and contributing to good mental health are all benefits of both the concessionary travel scheme and of community transport. We should therefore all unite in celebrating that. I would like to pay tribute to Lothian Community Transport Services, who operate in 3 local authority areas, Edinburgh, Mid Lothian and West Lothian. In Edinburgh, they operate a fleet of 8 accessible minibuses that are available for hire on a with-driver or self-drive basis to other voluntary and community organisations. They provide that lifeline service to about 130 different groups. The motion, in the name of Alison-McInnes, talks about the merits of extending the scheme to include all demand-responsive community transport services, but does not make reference to how this would be paid for. Age Scotland have recognised that cost implications would arise from extending the scheme and have made a specific suggestion about how this would be met. The Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, of which I am a member, received a range of written and oral evidence on this subject as part of its current inquiry into community transport. John MacDonald of the Community Transport Association highlighted one of the obstacles which would have to be overcome. In evidence to the committee on 17 April, he stated concessionary fares in community transport and Section 19 services could only ever work where there is a fare-paying passenger. There has to be an individual on the bus paying a fare. However, on many services, individuals do not pay fares. However, in discussing this proposal, it is important to recognise that while cost is a factor, it is not the only one, and indeed may not be the only barrier to the extension of the scheme. A number of witnesses have indicated that concessionary fares are not a priority. It has been suggested that the biggest challenge for community transport is in fact an ageing fleet, and that investment should be focused on funding for vehicles. In evidence to the committee on the 17th of April, John MacDonald also stated, and I quote, "Replacing vehicles is a big problem for well-established organisations that have been around for 20 or 30 years. If one thing should be a priority, it is vehicles." Giving evidence to the committee on the 1st of May, John Moore of Lothian Community Transport Services stated, "Funding fleet renewal is the biggest challenge that faces my organisation. We have an ageing fleet which is getting more expensive to maintain." When it was suggested to witnesses that the national concessionary scheme is not the right vehicle because of the costs involved, witnesses from a range of organisations replied in unison, yes. These organisations were Lothian Community Transport Services, WRVS, Badenoch and Strathspey Community Transport Company and South West Community Transport. The evidence we have received would suggest that there are a number of practical and logistical challenges, such as including introducing ticket machines to read the bus pass, which could cost more than £5,000 and possibly up to £10,000 in each case, and that there may be more pressing priorities for now, such as investment in an ageing fleet. Age Scotland have made a welcome contribution to the debate about the future of the national concessionary scheme and community transport, but the report should not be the final word. We should await the conclusions of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. We should seek to build a consensus on the way forward, and we should continue to listen to the providers and users of community transport services across Scotland to provide that lifeline service to many older and disabled people who need it.
Thank you. Call Anne McTaggart to be followed by Nanette Mill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am delighted to contribute to today's debate on the important subject of Age Scotland's Still Waiting campaign that promotes the extension of the existing national concessionary travel scheme. Firstly, I would like to congratulate Alison-McInnes-MSP for securing the time in Chamber today and to highlight the work of the campaign and commend Age Scotland for the excellent work that they have been carrying out to support Scotland's older people. I know that members across the Chamber will recognise the benefits brought by the advice, advocacy and assistance provided by Age Scotland to older people right across the country. My experience of working directly with volunteers of this exceptional charity has allowed me to understand the difference that this kind of support makes to older people in both urban and more rural areas of the region I represent. It is clear to the volunteers and the staff at Age Scotland that the needs of older people living in different areas are rarely the same. This is particularly true when we talk about the provision of transport and the availability of local bus services. The Still Waiting campaign aims to challenge the differing levels of available public transport by extending the current concessionary travel scheme to involve the community transport provisions that are often far more accessible for 188,000 disabled people in Scotland who are entitled to concessionary travel. As Age Scotland's own case studies show, extending the free travel pass scheme to include community transport providers would have profound benefits for some of the most vulnerable people living in our communities. It is easy to forget that a bus fare can mean the difference between feeling isolated or identifying as part of a wider community. By including the demand responsive transport services, such as those provided by the South West Community Transport Scheme in Glasgow, who I visited only last month, who help older people and disabled people to feel part of their local communities who otherwise wouldn't. There are currently over 180 community transport providers in Scotland who in the last year have provided over 3.5 million journeys. This is not a proposal that seeks to help only a handful of people. It addresses real needs in real communities. Our rapidly ageing population means that demand amongst older people for transport services will increase substantially. And this increase will inevitably require politicians to look again at the way that we provide concessionary travel to this growing population of vulnerable, older and disabled people. We should take action now to ensure that tomorrow's generation of retired and disabled people can enjoy the highest possible level of support without being restricted from the most accessible and beneficial transport services available to them and their communities.
Many thanks. I call on Annette Millen to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate and declare an interest as the Deputy Convener of the Cross-Party Group on Older People, Age and Ageing, and as the holder of an NCT card. I also extend my thanks to my fellow North East colleague Alison-McInnes for bringing this matter to the Chamber this afternoon. Governments of whatever political composition would be unwise to ignore the elderly lobby, given the fact that we're all living longer. Indeed, the average life expectancy for Scottish males born today is around 78.4 years, which is only a few years shy of Japan, which tops the international table at 82.7 years. Compare this with the year 1900, when male Scots would be likely to live to 45, and the projection that by 2035, men in Scotland will live to nearly 81 years of age. For these reasons, the role of charities such as Age Scotland is increasingly more relevant, and the various campaigns they have conducted over the years have highlighted the needs and demands of our ageing population. The motion today, as we know, focuses on the Still Waiting campaign to end isolation of the elderly by extending the existing national concessionary travel scheme to include all demand-responsive community transport. What this would mean for older people, it would mean is that older people who depend on community transport rather than commercial transport, especially in rural areas such as Aberdeenshire, would not have to pay any fares for their bus services. The key benefit of including community transport within the NCT scheme relates directly to the aim of helping older and disabled people to remain in their own homes for as long as possible, but at the same time providing the means to allow an individual to get out and about, to do their own shopping, to attend medical appointments and to socialise with friends. We've heard the results of the research showing that loneliness and social isolation has been shown to be more dangerous in some cases than a lifetime of smoking, with isolation leading to depression. A lack of interpersonal interaction is also a factor in the onset of degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, and therefore, by enabling older and disabled people to continue to play a full role in their communities, community transport may have a role in delaying the onset of such conditions. Age Scotland, and I quote, is of the view that the resulting improvements in health and social care outcomes of investment in community transport are wholly commensurate with the preventative spending agenda and would deliver substantial savings to the state. The motion also draws attention to the astonishing statistic that in remote rural areas, over two-thirds of those aged 60 or over either do not have or cannot use a free travel pass. Various reasons have been suggested for this, but it's clear that the most obvious would be that commercial bus operators are withdrawing from routes on the grounds of cost, meaning that more and more elderly people are cut off from others. Community transport services, which are often run by local charities, are therefore crucial in filling this void, but as they can't register with the Traffic Commissioner, they are ineligible for reimbursements under the NCT scheme. Age Scotland estimates that to extend that scheme as proposed would cost in the region of £11.2 million, and suggests that this cost, and again I quote, should be met by adjusting the eligibility criteria for the existing scheme. Clearly, what governments fund is a matter of political choice, but I hope the Minister will give serious consideration to this Still Waiting campaign, which, if successful, could result in significant benefit to many older and disabled people in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I commend the work of Age Scotland on behalf of Scotland's older population, and I look forward to welcoming representatives from the charity at the Scottish Conservative Party conference in Stirling next week.
Many thanks. Christine Graham to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I enjoyed the wee trailer there for your conference. Can I too congratulate Alison-McInnes on securing this debate, and indeed the whole tone of the debate. I adopt everything that has been said by other members about the benefits of the concessionary bus pass, social, health, well-being, psychological, you name it, people who would be stuck in their homes, seeing nobody all day long and getting out, meeting people on the buses. And indeed, sadly to say, sometimes in the winter, keeping warm on the buses when they can't afford to heat their homes. So we all recognise the merits, I think, of extending concessionary fare scheme to all community transport, but I think we all also recognise the financial constraints on the Scottish Government's purse, and these are set to get worse over the coming years, as we know, and they'll tighten because the Chancellor of the Exchequer in London has announced cutting hundreds of millions from domestic services in England, and those domestic portfolios affect ours because of the Barnett consequential. So we may see less, in fact, for transport, local government and so on. And we know that local government is one of the backers and supporters of community demand transport. So I'm very sympathetic with the case, and I've said so to the Minister. Indeed, recently I visited Tweed Wheels in my constituency, together with Teviot Wheels in the other part of the Borders, do excellent work providing transport to the disenfranchised from using their concessionary bus pass because, as others have said, there's no regular, routine, scheduled route of bus service to where they live. And indeed, in some parts, they're being withdrawn due to lack of demand. So I also visited Age Scotland and Galashiels to support their campaign, but they too are aware of the financial implications because the subsidy for the concessionary bus pass is 60p in every pound fare. But what's required for community demand transport is 100% to be put towards it. And that's a different matter entirely. And that's the rub again, as others have said, the cost. Now, the estimate as referred to by Nanette Milne at 11 million, that's based, as I understand, on the current usage of community demand transport. But if you make it free at the point of need, that demand will go up, because there's no doubt people are self-denying, they're not using it because it's too expensive. And Age Concern admitted to me they'll need to get more robust figures. So I do have sympathy, however, for the proposal to raise the age for the concessionary bus pass to fall in line as we go along with the raised age of pension across the UK. But again, I agree with Alison-McInnes, not retrospectively, and certainly not means testing. I think means testing is always there's winners and losers in it, and it's the losers who are just above the level, if you introduce a means test, who would lose their pass entirely. So don't agree with that. And indeed, it was interesting that not everybody has one, uses it, whether for a variety of reasons. So, in conclusion, I want to say I'm actually congratulating both Age Concern. I congratulate Tweed Wheels. I think they do a grand job taking people to journeys to doctors' surgeries, GPs' clinics and so on. But what I think we do require, and I don't know if the Minister has it, but certainly also from Age Concern, is tell us the cost. Tell us the cost. And if we have that cost, and we know what the savings would be if the concessionary bus pass was raised at different levels, would that match that cost? That's what we need to know.
Thank you very much. Ian Gray, to be followed by Alison Johnston.
Thank you. I wanted to speak in this debate really because two personal connections with the issue, one very old, going back more than 10 years, and the other current, but both, I think, with some relevance to the Age Scotland campaign and the debate we're having this afternoon. It was, as Minister for Enterprise, Transport and Lifelong Learning, who all those years ago introduced the national concessionary scheme, but it wasn't the scheme that we know today, because over time the bus pass has evolved. For instance, in the early days there was a charge for using the bus pass at peak times. The equalisation of ages came later. Because, of course, men and women had, in those days, different retirement ages. And when the pass first came into place, one of the greatest complaints about it was you could only use it locally and you couldn't cross boundaries, and some work had to be done before it became a national scheme. I even remember being in one meeting with pensioners' organisations where they complained bitterly that the bus pass wasn't able to be used on tour buses. So over time, the scheme has strengthened, although never enough to extend itself to tour buses. But also over time, I think we've come to understand that the greatest weakness of the scheme is exactly that. There's no point in having a bus pass if there is no service bus on which you can use it. And that's exactly the gap which is often covered by community transport, which is providing a day-to-day link in a way that, for example, tour buses never are. And so it seems very clear to me that, as Alison-McInnes said, this is unfinished business in terms of the evolution of the scheme, and it should be extended to cover community transport services. I also agree with Alison-McInnes and Christine Graham that it is entirely legitimate to debate the age eligibility for the bus pass, and the possibility perhaps of reducing that because of changes over time, but at the same time debate the extension of eligibility in terms of making the bus pass usable where the service is provided by community transport. The second connection that I think I have currently with this issue is that I have out to consultation at the moment a proposal for a bill, a members' bill, to change the regulatory framework for buses in Scotland. And that is exactly designed to try and find ways to facilitate more and more accessible bus services, primarily through a new franchise power for local authorities, but also through ways of allowing greater use of both local authorities' own fleets and encouraging more community transport to fill those gaps. And I believe that this bill could well provide a legislative vehicle to extend the concessionary scheme to community transport. And so I would encourage Age Concern and any supporters of the Still Waiting campaign to submit to my consultation submissions which make exactly that case. And on that, I just wanted to say gently to Jim Eadie, because I think this is in general a very consensual debate, that the argument for the extension to community transport is made and driven by the concerns of those elderly and disabled passengers who currently have to pay for community transport, rather than the community transport organisations themselves. I am sure that if you said to commercial operators, we're going to put £190 million into the bus industry, would you like to do it through a concessionary travel scheme, they would also say, no, that's not our priority, here are some other ways we would much rather you pursued. They're wrong. We pursue it that way because of the benefits that our older and disabled citizens get, and they should get that when they use community transport too.
Thank you very much. Alison Johnston, to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too would like to congratulate Alison-McInnes for securing this debate this afternoon. I'm pleased to support the Still Waiting campaign calling for the inclusion of all demand-responsive community transport services within the National Concessionary Travel Scheme. Local community transport providers play a very important role in our communities. They keep people who might otherwise be very isolated connected to their friends, the services they need, and most importantly, they enable many people to maintain their independence. Alison-McInnes' motion recognises the fact that the concessionary scheme is not benefiting as many people as it could or should. The flexibility of the community transport model fills the gap in rural areas where the public transport system can't reach every person who needs a lift into town, to the doctor's surgery, or into the village to attend a social event. And it's timely that Age Scotland, Age Concern, Leonard Cheshire Disability and others are working harder than ever to raise awareness of the need for greater support and investment in this sometimes overlooked service. The Community Transport Association's State of the Sector report highlighted the growth in demand from our changing demographic. The number of people over 75 is predicted to rise by 23% by 2020 and by 84% by 2033. And we know that commercial bus operators are withdrawing from routes on grounds of cost, isolating even more older and disabled people. And we've heard in earlier debates on this subject that the ambulance service lists to non-emergency appointments have been reduced. Leonard Cheshire note that 43% of respondents to their disability review had to miss a hospital appointment, and 18% were forced to turn down a job due to inaccessible transport. Community transport and access to it is essential. It gives us the opportunity to tackle problems before they become crises, and investing in community transport is common sense preventative spend. Savings in terms of improved health and well-being will deliver substantially, and they will increase the quality of life for many.
We all know elderly and less mobile friends and family who don't want to depend on us to get out and about and may decline offers of lifts. And of course, many families don't have access to private transport. Many community transport initiatives are delivered by volunteers, and the State of the Sector report demonstrated that volunteer time of some 278,000 hours annually is worth almost £107 million a year if valued at the minimum wage rate. Community transport, though, is simply invaluable to those who use the service. But we have a situation currently where if you're over 60 and able to reach a bus stop, you can use your concessionary pass. If, however, you're physically unable to reach a bus stop or are too far away from a bus stop, you can't take advantage of this potentially life-changing entitlement. Local people, communities, high streets will all benefit from extension of this concessionary scheme. It's important that we do all that we can to make it possible for everyone in Scotland to live a fulfilling and engaged life. The Still Waiting campaign is actively seeking to engage in discussion regarding how the increased cost of providing the service is met, and it's not acceptable in one of the wealthiest countries in the world to exclude people from opportunities due to a lack of affordable, accessible transport. We can and should address this. Jim Eadie spoke of challenges, but I do believe in this day and age we can read passes on community transport vehicles. All people in Scotland are entitled to concessionary travel, all older people, and I look forward to the day when all who wish to access this use with their concessionary bus pass can do so. Thank you.
Many thanks. And finally, Dr Elaine Murray.
Thank you. May I also start by congratulating Alison-McInnes for securing this debate, and also Age Scotland for raising this campaign on behalf of the users of community transport services. Many years ago, I raised the issue of the use of concessionary bus passes on community transport vehicles with the Transport Minister in the Labour-Liberal Scottish Executive. And indeed, I've supported it since, and support for community transport was part of the Labour debate in the Chamber on the 26th of January 2012. The reason I raised this was because it had been raised with me by the Annandale Transport Initiative after the nationwide concessionary fare scheme was announced in 2004. If I remember correctly, that was by Tavish Scott. ATI is one of the first organisations to take advantage of the Government's Rural Community Transport Grant Scheme, securing about £90,000 for a new bus in August 1999. And since then, they have provided an invaluable service with a number of vehicles to many of my constituents across Annandale and Eskdale. And support for community transport has also been raised by organisations such as WRVS, and it has been the subject of previous members' debates proposed by Karen Gillan and Jim Hume, to mention just two. It has always been clear to me that pensioner residents in rural parts of my constituency were disadvantaged by poor or non-existent bus services, and although they may be eligible for a bus pass, they have no opportunity to use it. However, it took the Still Waiting campaign to make me realise that this is not only a problem for rural pensioners. During the launch of the Still Waiting campaign, the predicament of a lady living in Leith was highlighted, who, because of her disability, was unable to access the services provided by Lothian buses, very good services normally, because she could not actually get to the bus stop, and therefore she was reliant on community transport provision. Community transport, we know, is essential for many pensioners attending hospital or visiting patients in hospital, and provides an essential service to parts of the health service. Now, concessionary bus pass use on community transport vehicles, as Jim Eadie has already said, has been raised during the evidence being taken by the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Community bus operators are permitted to run services that carry members of the public under Section 22 permit, on which passengers can use their bus pass, and that, of course, is very welcome. However, many buses used by individuals or groups, for example, for trips to the shops or medical appointments, have Section 19 licences, which are not currently eligible to participate in the concessionary bus pass scheme, and the Age Scotland campaign seeks to address the users of these services. Now, having listened to the evidence to the committee, I appreciate that this is not maybe as simple as it sounds initially, because reimbursement to operators where passengers use their free entitlement is set at 60% of the adult fare. So if you equate the existing charge to that fare, if all the passengers on the trip are eligible to use their bus pass, the income for that community transport operator would only be 60% of what it had been when they were charging. Now, Age Scotland proposed that to avoid this loss of income, community transport operators should be able to reclaim the cost at 100% of their charge. Now, with the situation as it is at the moment, there could be a problem there that in the community concessionary transport scheme is and always was intended to assist users and was not intended to be to subsidise operators. And I suppose it could be argued if more people started using community transport because they could use a bus pass, maybe the commercial operators might say, well, the community transport operators are somehow being subsidised by that. I don't know that that's actually permissible at the moment. However, it shouldn't be impossible to get around that particular obstacle. I think it needs to be looked at. It needs perhaps a consideration of a more innovative solution, which maybe takes into account, hopefully takes into account that the realisation of the fact that the contribution community transport can make to the well-being of older people is surely a form of preventative spend.
Thank you very much. Can I now invite Keith Brown to respond to the debate? Minister, in 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you as well to Alison-McInnes for having succeeded and raised this in the members' debate. Can I start by saying that, as a government, we've invested around £8.3 billion in transport since 2007, and I mention that because that is the largest transport investment programme Scotland has ever seen. And this has happened in very difficult economic times, and despite substantial cuts to our budget, one of which was around 26% cut to our capital budget. But despite that, our current investment in transport is directly supporting around 12,000 jobs across Scotland. And the Scotland-wide free bus travel scheme for older and disabled people is a very successful scheme, which is providing free local and long-distance bus travel throughout Scotland for older and disabled people at any time of day on any routes for any number of journeys. And in January this year, we reached agreement with the bus industry safeguarding the concessionary travel scheme for the next 2 years. The 2-year agreement provides fair reimbursement for bus operators and secures the financial sustainability of the scheme, something which we've been urged to do by parties in the Parliament and by the Parliament's Audit Committee as well. Can I say it's been a generally consensual debate, but there was something of a jibe, I think, at the start from Alison-McInnes about the Scottish Government, saying that we're still waiting for the Scottish Government to take action. I have to say there was no action taken on a specific issue by the previous Labour and Liberal Democrat executive, who she specifically exonerated from any criticism, despite the fact we've just heard from Elaine Murray that representations were made during that period to have this change made. It wasn't made. It's also worth pointing out there's been no budget proposal come forward from any party in the Parliament to actually make this change. And I think the reason I mention that is because that's when you know that the parties are most serious about proposals, when they actually say, we want to pay for this and this is how we'll pay for it, which obviously, given the speeches made by members here, is a very live issue. Can I say it's a very successful scheme? It's not the first one. When I was leader of Clackmannanshire Council, we introduced Scotland's first ever fully free, not off-peak, but fully free bus concessionary scheme. And I think it's great that it's now been extended by previous administrations and this administration to cover the entire country. Can I say that I think Jim Eadie raised some very important points, and it will be interesting to see the extent to which we can examine those during the course of the examination by the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. There are real issues here, not least of which, of course, is the fact that many community transport journeys are made in cars, which does present certain issues, some of which we've heard about today. In relation to Ian Gray's point, I've already said that we will look at the provisions of the bill which he mentioned, but I would also repeat that we will look at the cost. If this is to be contained within that bill, or if it's also to be supported, then we do have to look at the question of costs. Last year, I enabled community transport organisations running services under Section 22 registrations, which are open to the public, to be part of the concessionary travel scheme. So there has been that change made already. It's an option, although I do acknowledge it's not an option for all providers. In recognising that such DRT, demand-responsive transport register services, are not the answer for everyone, I can see that community transport has, of course, an important part to play in filling the gaps, and the Government supports, as previous administrations have done, the Community Transport Association. I'd also like to add my tribute to the dedicated volunteers who make up the backbone of community transport organisations and provide these services, sometimes over many years, to their local communities. I very much admire the commitment made by each and every person to become drivers and escorts for passengers. Yes?
Alison-McInnes.
Sorry. Does the Minister acknowledge, though, that there is an inherent unfairness in the system that means that some elderly and disabled people, a significant minority, have to pay for their bus fares simply because of market failure?
Minister.
Well, I would say that, given the other comments which Alison-McInnes has made, it's going to be the case, unless you provide it free for everybody, which I don't think anybody's proposed, that some groups will not have the same access as others. I acknowledge that point. The point that Alison-McInnes made, which I think was speaking in support of raising the age in line with pensions, is the first time that's been proposed. I don't know if that is, well, it's been mentioned, but it's not been proposed. If that is the position of the Liberal Democrats, then I think that's an honest position, because you're saying you can perhaps pay for some or all of the additional cost of the extension. If I can just try and make some more progress, if you can do that. Well, it's the first time I've understood it to be the position of a party. If it is, then, as I say, it's more honest, because it does say you can find the money from this other place. I should make clear to everyone who's mentioned it that it's not the Scottish Government's position that we intend to change the age of eligibility. We think in the times that we currently are living in, it's very important to have that provision for people at that age as we currently have. But I acknowledge the point that's made by Alison-McInnes. We've made changes as well to the bus registration legislation from the 1st of April to allow demand-responsive transport services, those which are available to the general public, to qualify for concessionary travel and for bus service operators grant. At the same time, as changes are made to BSOG in order to calculate the grant based on distance travelled rather than on fuel used. It would appall some people to find that the previous scheme allowed bus service operators grant to be paid for buses which were carrying no passengers, and that's now been changed. I know for at least in respect of what they call dead running before. I know from discussions with operators themselves that this change has been of benefit to many rural bus operators specifically, including eligible community transport operators. Age Scotland themselves recognise in the research that transport services are crucial and are appreciated by older people, a point made by, I think, all members. They also present some very useful information from the CTA for consideration about the scope of the sector, and the research provides estimates. 100,000 people benefit from CT in Scotland each year, currently 70,000 older CT users, 3.5 million trips per year, 62% of users aged 60 or older, 16% of users disabled. And the overall demand, the point I think made by Christine Graham, the overall demand may rise to an estimated 83,500 of older users by 2022. And that doesn't, I think, take into account the potential exponential rise if this is provided as a free good. Local authorities were provided with resources by the Government for the provision of community transport services through the Local Government Finance Settlement following the concordat between them and the Scottish Government. And that's right, as councils will have a better understanding of transport needs in their immediate areas. Local authorities can also commission bus services which go further to meet the needs of people across Scotland and in some more rural, isolated areas. SPT already coordinating a forum for community transport operators which will help to develop the sector, and that's to be welcomed. We've also worked closely with local government to provide fair and equitable settlements between 2007-8 and 12-13. The resources available to the Scottish Government from DEL and non-domestic rates increased by 6.4%, but over the same period, local government's budget increased by 8.9%, which I think is a strong financial settlement, and allows them to do things in relation to community transport if they choose to do that. But also maintaining the revenue funding available to local government as well. The total funding from the Scottish Government to local government next year will amount to around £10.3 billion, roughly about a third of all the budget that we have. And that provides resources to allow councils to support community transport provision in their area. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Age Scotland have proposed that concessionary travel arrangements might be extended to community transport. There are some practical issues around that, many of which have not been raised today, a number of which have been raised, not least by Jim Eadie, over and above the issue of affordability. But I will be listening to the points made as the campaign progresses, and I will also study with real interest the findings of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee's inquiry into community transport when they report later in the year.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes Alison-McInnes' debate on Still Waiting campaign, and I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30.